All right, good morning, everyone. And just picking up there that once again we can take great joy in the hope of the kingdom as we see the effects of mortality around us. Want to first off thank you for the invitation. It's been 16 years since we've been at this Bible school. Let's see if this clicker will work for me here. So this is the last time we're at this Bible school. Unfortunately, the three boys couldn't make it with us this week. We were all just a Midwest Bible school last week, so I'm getting my fill of dorm mattresses. Going to do a 2-week trial there, and then they're home for a couple weeks, and then they're heading off to Manitoulin Youth Conference. So they couldn't make it. Sister Nikki is here. So what we're going to do now is we're going to flash forward 16 years. So this picture was just taken over the summer. As you can see, I've turned from the tall one of the family to the short one of the family. It's amazing what 16 years can do. We're very thankful that all three boys are baptized, and Ellie Sheva Billington there is a good, let's say, a very, very close special friend for Zach. But we're very thankful for the invite. One other tidbit that I have to share is Sister Nikki job shares with a partner, and she had these 2 weeks all clear for vacation until she found out her partner had booked this week of vacation. So Sister Nikki is here. She's just back in the room working. No, she's actually working. And she'll be, with us, from mid-afternoon on for all the days. But, she has to put in some, legitimate show of working here. So that was a bit of a downer, but just glad to be here with everybody. And in case you're wondering what we've been doing for the last 16 years, we've been doing this. We're on the committee at Manitoulin Kids Camp. So literally, I think just a year or two after the last time we were here, we went to kids camp for the first time. And I think the phrase is we got sucked in. We got assimilated to the chaos. So this is the group picture from last year. Now, it's kind of strange, but this camp normally conflicts with this Bible school, except 2 out of every 7 years it doesn't, just the way they time it. So those 2 years it doesn't conflict with this one, we'd love to see your kids there. 8 through 16 is the age range, and there's tons of support. If the parent wants to go, we got a job for you. We got a lot of support staff there, so it really is a phenomenal week. But Mike, our oldest, graduated from the program. Last year was his last year, so we're currently, considering whether we stay on the committee or, maybe let others have sleepless nights and, we move on to something else. But that's what we've been doing. So great once again to be here with everybody and renew our fellowship and friendship in the truth. Okay, so this week we are going to be talking about prototyping Christ. Now, you may be wondering what's all this talk about prototyping, right? I'm an engineer. Some of you know I've worked at Ford. I've worked at Ford for the last 32 years. So, sticking with the theme of analogies, Brother Allen, we're going to be making some engineering analogies this week. Do we have any engineers in the audience? And any other fellow nerds? Okay, yeah, okay, good. So we ready to nerd out a little bit this week? No, maybe? Okay, we'll give it a try. So we'll get into the prototyping more at the end of this first class, and then continue with a theme that really I was shocked as I went through Colossians. And then I thought about all the prototyping experiences we've had at Ford over the years. There was a lot of applicability and a pretty strong analogy between, the good and the bad of prototyping Christ and the good and the bad of, engineering prototyping. So hopefully you see the same thing I did here, but we'll start getting into that a little bit more towards the end of the first class. Before we start, though, this is all based on a thematic study of Colossians. All right, so sticking with the trivia questions, we're going to have some Colossians trivia. Now, you are not intended to do very good on this quiz because the whole point is, I want to make here is I think Colossians is a little bit of a neglected epistle. I know at least I myself, had not quite gotten into Colossians before, maybe the way I've gotten into some of the other Apostle Paul's epistles. But, whatever the result is on this little quiz, it's all good. You couldn't do any worse than I did, Brother Guy, on that opening quiz. I got 0 for 6 and was tied with Gma. Are you Gma? Who was GMA? We were tied for dead last. So, thank you, Chima. Appreciate it. All right, so, sorry for calling you out there. All right, so, first question. Paul established the Colossian ecclesia, and there we see Colossae is kind of due east of Ephesus there. On the first missionary journey, second missionary journey, third missionary journey, or Paul never visited there? So anyone want to venture a guess on that one? Never visited there. See, we got the winner over here in the first row. The good students always sit in the first row, or second row, close enough. Yeah, Paul never visited there. So if you just take a look at Colossians 2, let's open our Bibles to Colossians. Colossians 2, verse 1. For I would that ye know what great conflict I have for you and for them of Laodicea, and for as many as have not seen my face in the flesh. Now there is some indication that Paul eventually made it to Colossae. We kind of get this from Philemon, verse 22, which we don't need to look up right now. But at this time, he's in prison in Rome. Remember at the end of Acts, he ended up in Rome in prison. At this time, he had not yet visited Colossae. So that right there makes Colossae and Colossians a bit unique because it's the only epistle Paul wrote to an ecclesia that he had not yet visited. So all the information he's getting about these brothers and sisters is secondhand. Okay, question number 2. This person established the Colossian ecclesia. John Mark on the first journey, Timothy on the second journey, Epaphras on the third journey, or Tychicus while Paul was in prison in Rome. Kind of a tricky question. Tychicus, close. C. Epaphras on the third journey. Now, I just got done saying, Paul never visited Colossae on any of his missionary journeys to this point. But he did visit Ephesus. He spent 3 years in Ephesus on the third missionary journey. And it appears that Epaphras learned the truth from Paul in Ephesus and then took it to his hometown of Colossae. And you'll notice there in the chapter we read, in chapter 1, verses 7 and 8, and ye also learned of Epaphras, our dear fellow servant, who's for you a faithful minister of Christ, who also declared unto us your love in the Spirit. And then there's also over in chapter 4, verse 12, Epaphras, who is one of you, a servant of Christ, saluteth you, also laboring fervently for you in prayers, that ye may stand perfect and complete in all the will of God. So maybe connecting a couple dots here, but it does appear that Epaphras was a native Colossian, learned the truth while Paul was in Ephesus on the third journey, and then took it to Colossae. So Epaphras on the third journey. probably the correct answer. Okay. Another interesting question here. Colossae was a sister ecclesia with A, Ephesus and Philippi, B, Laodicea and Hierapolis, C, Philadelphia and Thyatira, and D, Lystra and Derbe. C. Any other ones? B. Right. Answer is B, Laodicea and Hierapolis. And you can see on the map there that these ecclesias are very close together. Like, in Detroit, we have 4 ecclesias that are reasonably close together. This would be a similar situation where you really have sister ecclesias that would have quite a bit to do with each other. If you go over to Colossians 2, verse 1, you kind of see what I'm talking about here. For I would, we already read that verse, but it mentions Laodicea, and then over in chapter 4, verse 13, for I bear him record that he hath a great zeal for you, and for them that are in Laodicea, and them that are in Hierapolis. And it's kind of a beautiful area, really. I'm going to sound like the Turkish Tourism Bureau here, but this is one of the hot spots in Turkey for fun stuff to do. There's a lot of archaeological ruins. There's tons of thermal springs, hikes. It's really a beautiful area here in what's called the Lycus Valley. Interestingly, I forgot to look at that verse too. If you keep on reading in chapter 4, verses 15 and 16, the Colossians were actually told to take their letter and share it with the brothers and sisters in Laodicea, and then the Laodiceans were told to share the letter they had received with the Colossians. Now, there's different theories there. Some people feel the letter being referenced as the letter to Laodicea was actually the letter to the Ephesians. It might have actually been a separate letter sent to the Laodiceans. But in any event, they were commanded to share their letters with each other, and they were very, very close sister ecclesias. To the point where we could almost imagine they were probably pretty similar strengths, weaknesses, things they were struggling with, things they were good at, would be pretty similar between these two ecclesias. Okay, so Dave, this is your chance to shine on Tychicus here. Tychicus, who delivered Colossians from Rome, from Paul in prison, also delivered at this time the letter to the Ephesians, the letter to Philemon, the letter to the Philippians, A and B, or all the above. I'll give you a hint. Philemon was from Colossae. Anyone for A and B?
Okay, all of these above.
Okay. Correct answer, A and B. Tried to throw the softball to him, but he wasn't taking. So, there is a flood of letters coming into this area at this time. The letter to the Colossians, the letter to the Ephesians was delivered by Tychicus at the same time. The letter to Philemon, perhaps a separate letter to the Laodiceans at the end of Colossians chapter 4. Paul he's almost like carpet bombing Asia Minor with letters, which is interesting. That may be an indication that, maybe something was going on that needed to be corrected. And then lastly, and probably most importantly, why this is the neglected epistle. People find Colossians a difficult book because there's A, no historical context from the Acts, B, some sections are difficult to understand, C, there's tough wrested scriptures, or D, all the above. All right. You redeemed yourself. Yeah, all the above. I don't know if you noticed some tough wrested scriptures in chapter 1 today, But did you notice that language about, how Christ was there from the beginning and, he was, had a creative role, and a lot of people latch onto that verse and say, hey, Jesus is part of the Trinity, he was there from the beginning, he was the creator. And we'll look at those verses in a second and as usual, find out that context is everything. We really need to understand what the total message is of the Apostle Paul there to understand those verses. So we'll get to those in a second. But back to the Turkish Tourism Bureau. These are some pictures. Now, we were at Ontario Winter Bible School. I don't know, has anyone here ever been to Ontario Winter Bible School? It's kind of over the Christmas week, kind of way north in Ontario. It's like super cold, tons of snow, lots of fun. Brother Simon O'Grady was there, and he shared some of his pictures. He's done a lot of touring in this area with his family. It is one of the largest concentrations of ruins in the Roman Empire. There's extensive ruins at Hierapolis and Laodicea. There's what's called the Travertine Hot Springs. So if anyone's ever been to like Yellowstone or something like this, this is described as Yellowstone on steroids. It's really beautiful. And of course, a ton of history. This was a hotbed of ecclesial activity, obviously in the first century, with 3 separate ecclesias being in close proximity there. Now, as far as Colossae itself, there's really not much left. Most of the ruins are in Laodicea and Hierapolis. And Colossae itself is really just a mound. It hasn't been excavated yet. And there's just a historical marker there where the city Acropolis used to be, with just a few ruins scattered about. So that's kind of interesting that, the Colossie's just been left alone. It's basically just a big mound at this point. But it indeed is a very fruitful area. In Paul's time, it was famous for sheep and dyed wool and vineyards. You can see some of the pictures of, so the Lycus River, if you're a geography buff, flows into the Meander River. And let's see if I can get this pointer working here. The Meander River flows out here to the, what's that, Dave, the Aegean Sea there? So it's really a beautiful area for hiking, very scenic, very prosperous, very fertile. So this is where that ecclesia was located. Okay, so we had chapter 1 of Colossians read this morning, and it appears that the Colossian ecclesia was off to a pretty good start. They're called the faithful brethren in verse 2. They're noted for their faith in verse 4. They're noted for their love in verse 4. They're noticed for bringing forth fruit in verse 6. Epaphras also declared unto us your love in verse 8. Join in beholding your order and steadfastness of your faith in Christ, verse 5 of chapter 2. And then over in chapter 4, for I bear him, Epaphras, record that he hath a great zeal or excitement of mine for you, and them that are Laodicea, and them that are at Hierapolis. So sounding pretty good. Faith, love, bringing forth fruit, those are all good things. We get these little hints, though, these little hints in Colossians that they're struggling. And the first hint we get here is in chapter 2, verse 5. The words order and steadfastness. Both of these are actually military terms, which the Apostle Paul uses a lot in his writings. Order means a regular arrangement, a post or a rank. The basic idea is one of a military formation. So you can just imagine all these, Colossians and probably those of Laodicea and Hierapolis were standing in formation, usually to resist an attack. And steadfastness is also from a Greek word which has the idea of a solid front line. So the picture we're given here in chapter 5 or chapter 2 verse 5 is almost an ecclesia in a defensive position and seemingly under attack. And this is kind of backed up by some phrases we get from Paul and Epaphras. Number one, they're praying always for you. Now, the Apostle Paul kind of said that about most ecclesias, right? If you read most of the epistles, he's praying for those ecclesias. But then in verse 9, he says, we do not cease to pray for you, which is really kind of the next step of that statement, one that we don't find in a lot of other places. But, he's literally just praying for you, praying for them constantly. And then Epaphras in chapter 4, verse 12, who is one of you, a servant of Christ, saluteth you, always laboring fervently for you in prayers. Now, the Greek word, and apologies if I totally botched this pronunciation, but agonizomai, something like that, you can see is where we get our word agonize, right? So Epaphras was literally agonizing over something. It means to struggle, to contend with an adversary. It's a word in the Greek language that was applied to athletics, specifically wrestling. And the Apostle Paul uses the same word is translated striving in chapter 1, verse 29. But, the idea is Epaphras was in agony over something and causing him to labor fervently or agonize in prayers. And the Apostle Paul in chapter 2, verse 1, uses a similar Greek word, for I would that you know what great conflict I have for you and for them at Laodicea. And once again, the word is a similar word, Greek agon, a place of contest or a battle. And it's related to the Greek word agonia, where we get our word agony from. So Epaphras and Paul were really worried. Really, really worried. And, I think it's good for us, to think about what they were so worried about, because it might apply to us. If these ecclesias were struggling with something, it might be something we are struggling with as well. So, why were they so worried? Did anyone pick anything up as we read Colossians 1 that looked like a big emphasis of the Apostle Paul, especially towards the second half of the chapter? It's just something he emphasizes over and over and over again. And it's good. It's all good. It's nothing bad, but the fact that he's emphasizing it so much would indicate that maybe it's something they were struggling with. Sorry, did I hear something?
The influence of others.
The influence of others? Yep.
If you continue in the faith.
If you continue in the faith. Excellent. Any other ideas? Pete?
Not moved away from the hope of God.
Moving away from the hope of God? I'm just going to read, and you guys are progressively getting closer and closer to what I was thinking about anyways. But let me just read these verses to you again. We're just going to pop them up on the screen as well. We'll just start with verses 15 through 18. Who, of course this is speaking of Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of every creature. For by him were all things created that were in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created by him and for him. For he is before all things, and by him all things consist. And he is the head of the body of the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in all things he might have the preeminence. What's the big focus there? Jesus, right? It's almost like too easy, right? I probably threw you off, but he is really focused on Jesus, which leads us to believe that if they were struggling with something, it might have had something to do with Jesus. And we see here, Sister Nikki and I taught our junior CYC for many years, and one of the things we did was rest in scriptures. So we'd come to Colossians, right? And how do you explain, for by him were all things created that are in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers, all things were created by him and for him. How do you explain that to somebody that believes the Trinity, that believes that Jesus was there right from the beginning, consciously, co-creating everything with the Father and the Spirit? Well, what we're going to see here is the context is all about the preeminence of Christ. The fact that Christ has to be number one in our lives. And the way the apostle goes about saying that and proving that is that Jesus has been in God's plans from the get-go. I used to think Jesus was almost like a plan B, right? Everything was supposed to go great with Adam and Eve in the garden, and when it didn't, the angels had to scramble and come up with some plan of salvation. No, it was always about Jesus. And indeed, those words, when it says he's before all things, we know that the idea there is that he was in God's plans from the very beginning. It's interesting. Here it says, by him all things consist, which has the idea of holding all things together. It doesn't say by all things exist. It says by all things consist, which is the fact that he is kind of the glue that holds all things together. And another good one, if you're into rested scriptures, he's the firstborn of every creature, but then later on it says he's the firstborn from the dead. So clearly we're talking about the new creation here. But notice it says here, let me see here, that in all things he might have the preeminence. Now the Greek here literally means number one. So how many people watched the World Cup Championship on Sunday? Anyone? Brave souls? Yep. What was everyone doing after the game? Who's number one? Spain, right? The point the apostle is making here is, guys, there's only one number one in your life, which is Jesus. You should only have one number one. Now, we all struggle with this, right? There's, especially in this day and age, we're getting pulled in multiple different directions. And we're going to see in chapter 2 tomorrow that the things that were pulling them, surprise, surprise, are exactly the same things that are pulling us in the 21st century. Not surprising, because human nature hasn't changed, right? The same things they struggle with are the same things we struggle with. And they just pull us away from Christ. And that, as we develop these themes from Colossians, we'll see is really the main thrust of this book. He's spoken of as the firstborn of the dead, that in all things he might have the preeminence, that he might be number one. In him should all fullness dwell. In him are hid all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. For in him dwelleth all the fullness of the Godhead bodily, which is the head of all principality and power. Christ is all and in all. So here we have this theme that Jesus is number one in our lives, or should be number one in our lives. And do you notice the repetition of the word all? You know, what the Apostle Paul is telling us is, look, you know, Jesus is the center of everything. He should be the center of our lives, and he is the center of God's plan and purpose. And a great verse, which is almost, a lot of people use it as almost the key verse for Colossians, in Colossians 1 verse 27, to whom God would make known what is the riches of the glory of this mystery among the Gentiles, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. Okay. We made a big deal about prototyping at the beginning. So now's the part where we're going to explain that, or hopefully explain it. Okay. Two key verses in Colossians. Who is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of every creature, talking about Jesus, right? And then chapter 3, verse 10, and have put on the new man, which is renewed in the knowledge after the image of him that created him. Talking about us, right? So Jesus is the image of God. We have to become the image of Jesus. Now, a little bit more Greek here. This word image is from the Greek word icon. Anyone, like on their phones all the time, and I don't even send people texts anymore. I just send them icons, right? Thumbs up, okay, thank you, But really what the word means is a likeness, literally a statue or profile, a representation or resemblance, an image. It almost sounds a little idolatrous, right? But that's not what's being talked about here. What's being talked about is perhaps imperfect. In our case, is definitely imperfect. But in some ways, a representation of the, let's say, the original. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example. And the only reason I can do this is because Sister Nikki is not here. She's stuck working. So we're going to have some fun at Sister Nikki's expense here. And I'm going to pay for this later, okay? But just keep it between us, all right? No. All right, so this is an activity we love to do at Senior CYC. The activity is very simple. You grab a partner, you get some paintbrushes and something to paint on, and you just do your best rendition of that person, okay? Now, I think my rendition of Sister Nikki's spot on. She doesn't think so. She thinks it's terrible. Her rendition to me, I don't think looks like me at all, but now that I look at the picture, yeah, it probably does, Receding hairline, she got that. Graying beard, she got that. But this is kind of the idea behind the image, right? It's a rendition of the original, right? It's a prototype in engineering parlance. So let's talk a little bit about that. What is a prototype? If we're going to kind of geek out a little bit here on the engineering side of things, a prototype is an early sample, a model, a release of a product built to test a concept or process. So it sounds a little bit like an icon or an image. It's really something that is a representation of the final product or the ultimate original intent. And what we're going to see over the course of these classes is, if we kind of go back to prototypes, we will see some real similarities between what Paul's teaching them about being an icon of Christ and what we've learned over the years as far as what makes good and bad prototypes. Everyone with me? Is that sounding reasonable? Another analogy, so we're going to be getting a lot of analogies this week. So we are going to pick on intake manifolds. Is anyone into cars here? Is anyone into engines? All right. Many years ago, exactly 32 years ago, I started out at Ford Motor Company as an intake manifold engineer. So I've retained a bit of memory of what goes on here. Who can tell me what an intake manifold does? Has a very simple job. I'll give you a hint.
It intakes stuff.
I need more than that. It could just be a tube, yes.
Mixes air and fuel together.
Mixes air and fuel together, that's first and foremost, especially when we had carburetors. What's another? Now I'll give you a hint. Engines these days have multiple cylinders. 4 cylinders, 6 cylinders, or 8 cylinders. Okay? Your air coming in is just coming in from one source, right? Through and into the intake manifold. So what would you say is the most fundamental job? Brother Brad.
Mixture into each cylinder.
Right. Unevenly or evenly? Evenly. Right. The job of an intake manifold is to take that air and fuel coming in and split it evenly to all the different cylinders. If you get a lot more air and fuel in one cylinder than another cylinder, it sounds like that first car you owned, right? Where like one of the cylinders wasn't even running at all, right? And it's like, the kind of uneven firing. So intake manifolds, pretty simple. Yeah, we could get into some more things they do, but that would put everyone to sleep. So we'll just stick with distributing everything equally to the cylinders. So what you're looking at there is the finished product, right? That comes off production tooling, really expensive tooling. When we build engines with this intake manifold, we're making one every 18 seconds. Every 18 seconds, another engine comes off the end of the line. So we need production tooling that can pop these things out really fast, right? We need tooling that can make intake manifolds at a rapid pace. Well, when we're testing these things 3 years for production, do we have that tooling? No. So we have to make prototypes. We have to make parts that are not a perfect representation of the final product, but we try to get as close as we can. So here are some of the different intake manifold prototypes that we make. Now, has anyone here heard of 3D printing, where you literally just build a prototype layer by layer by layer by layer? We can do that out of plastic, right? We can make intake manifold prototypes out of plastic, but they're not good for anything, right? If you really have to get a full-scale part to set on your desk so you can just look at it and kind of, get all excited about it, you can do it. If maybe you want to see how it fits with other components in the engine, you can do that approach. You might even be able to run a flow test on it with just room temperature air to see how it flows, but can you put it on a running engine where there's a lot of heat? No, wouldn't do you any good at all. It actually would melt. So then they figured out how to do this 3D printing process, but with metals. So there you can put it on a running engine. You can run it on a vehicle. But the problem is, we don't make intake manifolds out of metals anymore. We actually make them out of engineered plastic, like a high-strength plastic. Why? Because it's Ford Motor Company. Cheaper and lighter, cheaper and lighter, cheaper and lighter. So we actually make them out of plastic, which has made it really difficult to make a good prototype that really represents what the final production product can do. And has been a real challenge for really all automotive engineers. But you can see why you need a proper prototype. If you look at that picture on the right, believe it or not, engines can still backfire. And if you have an intake manifold made out of plastic that isn't designed right, what can happen? boom, it blows up. And people don't like that. You know, when it sounds like a bomb going off under their hood, they typically are unhappy. So that part has to be designed structurally to withstand that. But can you do that with a plastic? You know, just a cheap, you know, simple plastic? No. Can't do it with a metal prototype because that's not the final material. So we have to do it with a prototype that is as close as we can get it. Here's a picture of the old Ford Highland Park plant making Model Ts. And, you know, not bragging here, but Henry Ford did invent the moving production line. And, you know, that's where this problem really started, is we are making vehicles at a vehicle level. Every minute, another vehicle comes off the end of the production line. Thanks, brother guy. Every minute, another vehicle comes off. So we need tooling that can spit out parts fast. And that means when you test up front, you need a good prototype method. So where we're going to take this is we're going to look tomorrow at things that were kind of pulling them away from being good prototypes of Christ and see if we can see any. Now look, this all stays in the room, okay? There's no Zoom here. We've figured all this out at Ford, right? I'm just going back 10 years, you know. We'll look at some ways we messed up making prototypes and see if there's any similarities to how we can mess up being prototypes of Christ. Third class, we're going to look at a key issue of prototypes, which is materials, and see if we can see any comparisons between being Christ prototypes. And then in classes 4 and 5, we're going to look at how to be good prototypes of Christ and see, once again, if we can see any similarities to, at a spiritual level, with us being prototypes of Christ. Now, maybe it's just because I like nerdly things, but I was really amazed at the parallels. And maybe this shouldn't be a huge surprise because, you know, God created everything, right? He created the spiritual plan and purpose, and, you know, he created the physical world, and it's probably not surprising that we see some similarities between the physical world and spiritual lessons. Just like Brother Allen is noticing similarities between healing of diseases and spiritual lessons. Okay, so summary for today. Colossae is a sister ecclesia with Laodicea and Hierapolis, established during the third missionary journey by Epaphras. Paul had not yet visited there. I think as a result of that is, you know, Colossians is a bit of the forgotten epistle. So hopefully this can also help us kind of get more familiar with this book of Colossians and what it's about. They were off to their good start. They were noted for their faith and love. Paul and Epaphras prayed frequently and seemed really worried for them, like literally agonizing for them. A big theme in Colossians 1, Christ needs to be number one in our lives. And I think we'll see in Colossians 2 that there were things pulling them away from Christ big time. We need to be images, which is an icon or a prototype of Christ. Perfect? Absolutely not. But when someone looks at us, they need to see some part of Christ reflected in us. And I think we're going to find in the 4th and the 5th class that there's some fairly straightforward recipes that we're given there to prototype Christ in our lives. So the rest of the week, we're going to see how we can most or least effectively prototype Christ in our lives. So looking forward to renewing acquaintances. So we'll get Sister Nikki out of her room about 2 o'clock or so, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk to everyone over the course of the week.